Welcome back to the channel. This is part 2 of our deep dive into the terrifying story of Richard Ramirez, the man the world came to know as the Night Stalker. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I strongly recommend watching that episode first. In part 1, we explored Ramirez's early life, the influences that shaped him, and the beginning of the crime spree that spread fear across Southern California. In this episode, we'll follow the investigation as authorities close in on their suspect, examine the mistakes that exposed him, and uncover how one of America's most notorious serial killers was finally brought to justice. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our true crime documentaries. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 5. The victims. Before we follow Richard Ramirez into the courtroom, before we examine the trial and its aftermath, we must pause here, in the middle of this narrative, and turn our full attention to the people he hurt, because any story about a killer that does not center the people who were killed, the people who survived, the families who were shattered, has failed in a fundamental moral obligation. The confirmed death toll attributed to Richard Ramirez is 13 murders. There were also numerous sexual assaults, attempted murders, and other violent crimes. The total number of survivors and their family members whose lives were permanently altered by his actions runs into the dozens, perhaps higher. Let us speak of some of them. Jenny Vinco was 79 years old when she was killed in her apartment in Glassell Park on June 28, 1984. Confirmed victim. She was a grandmother. She had lived a long life, had survived her own hardships, had built a life that was modest and ordinary and dignified. Her son Jack found her body the next morning. He spent years after painful aftermath of violent loss, carrying the weight of that discovery, the image he could never fully put away. The murder of Jenny Vinco was the act that began everything, the first domino in a sequence of destruction that would unwind over more than a year. Dale Okazaki was 34 years old when she was shot in the head in her Rosemead condominium on March 17, 1985. She worked at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott. She was young. She had her whole life in front of her. Roommate, Maria Hernandez, who survived the same attack by the deflection of her keys, has spoken publicly about the decades of survivors' guilt and grief that followed, about the weight of having lived when Dale did not, about the complicated emotions of being grateful for a miracle and devastated by what that miracle could not extend to her friend. Tsai Lian Yu was 30 years old, a traffic officer with the Monterey Park Police Department, when she was pulled from her car and shot. On the same night, Dale Okazaki was killed. She died 2 days later. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable courage and dedication, a person who had chosen a career in public service, who was out in the world doing work that mattered. She deserved to come home that night. She did not. Vincent and Maxine Zazzara were married when they were murdered in Whittier on March 27, 1985. They were killed in their bedroom, in what should have been the most private and most protected space imaginable. Maxine's body was mutilated after her death, an act of savagery so extreme that investigators who had seen much violence in their careers were shaken. Their son Louis Zazzara would spend years afterward dealing with the grief and the rage and the impossible question of why his parents had been chosen, why their home had been the one that Richard Ramirez entered that night. Harold Wu was 66 years old when he was shot and killed in his home in Monrovia on May 14, 1985. His wife, Jean, survived, but the assault she endured left her with physical and psychological wounds that did not heal easily or completely. She had to rebuild herself and her life in the shadow of what had been done to her and in the shadow of what had been done to her. Permanent absence of her husband, Malville Keller, survived the attack on her home in Burbank. Her sister Blanche Wolfe did not. Blanche Wolfe was 83 years old. She was beaten to death in her own home, in a neighborhood where she had, presumably, lived safely for years, by a man she had never met, and who had no reason, in any rational accounting of the world, to want her dead. Nalviel Keller lived with that loss, and with her own injuries, and with the knowledge that she had survived something her sister had not, for the rest of her life. Mary Louise Cannon was 75 years old when she was murdered in her home in Arcadia on July 2. Joyce Lucille Nelson was 61 when she was beaten to death in her home. Monterey Park on July 5th. Maxon Knighting was 66, and Leila Knighting was 64 when they were shot in their beds in Glendale on July 20th. Each of these people had names, histories, families, communities. Each of their deaths left behind a specific and irreplaceable absence. Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, survived the attack on her home in Sierra Madre on July 5, 1985. She was struck with a tire iron. The weapon shorted out on an electrical wire, and that accidental intervention saved her life. She was 16 years old. She should never have been in that position. The fact that she survived was a mercy, but the experience of surviving that kind of violence, the trauma of knowing that someone entered your home and tried to kill you, does not simply resolve itself because the survivor lived. Whitney Bennett carried that night with her. Bill Carnes survived being shot 3 times in the head, though with devastating consequences. He was left with permanent brain damage, with cognitive and physical impairments that robbed him of the life he had before. August 24, 1985. He was 29 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. Inez Erickson, who survived the same attack, went on to become an advocate for crime victims, channeling her experience and her anger and her survival into something that tried to help others. But no one should have had to become that kind of advocate in that way. Peter Pan was killed in San Francisco. Barbara Pan survived but was left with serious injuries. Their children, their community, their neighbors, all of them living with the aftermath of a night that should never have happened. And there were more than 13 deaths. More than a handful of assaults. There were attacks that did not result in death. There were survivors who have never spoken publicly. There were children who were present in homes when their parents were attacked, who saw or heard things that children should never see or hear, who grew up with those memories folded into their understanding of the world. The full human cost of what Richard Ramirez did in those months cannot be fully tallied. It spreads outward from the immediate victims in concentric rings, to family members, to neighbors, to an entire city that lived in fear, to the investigators who absorbed the horror of crime scene after crime scene and carried that weight in their own lives and their own psychology. The violence radiated outward, and its effects did not stop when the handcuffs went on. This is what it means to be the victim of a serial killer. Not just the immediate, terrible fact of the violence, but the long aftermath. Decades of living with what was done. The impossibility of ever fully returning to the person you were before. Richard Ramirez did not just commit 13 murders. He committed 13 murders and dozens of other violent crimes and left behind a landscape of suffering that extended far beyond any individual crime scene. That is what must be kept in mind as we follow the story into the courtroom, as we watch the trial and hear the verdict. The legal process was important. Justice, whatever justice can look like in cases like this, mattered. But the legal process was never more than a partial accounting for what had actually been lost. There is one more thing worth noting about the victims of Richard Ramirez. Something that speaks to the specific character of the fear he generated in Los Angeles in 1985. His victims were diverse. They were young and old, male and female. They were white, Hispanic, Asian. They were married couples and single individuals. They lived in working-class neighborhoods, and middle-class suburbs. They lived in Los Angeles proper, and in the county, and in San Francisco. Some lived alone. Some lived with families. This diversity was not accidental, but it was not exactly strategic either. Ramirez chose his victims largely based on opportunity. On which houses presented accessible entry points, on which neighborhoods he found himself wandering through in a given night, on which targets presented themselves to him. As he moved through the city, he was not targeting a specific demographic. He was targeting vulnerability, accessibility, and privacy. And this is precisely what made him so terrifying. A killer who targets a specific type of victim allows potential victims who don't match that profile to feel safe. But Richard Ramirez could strike anywhere, could choose anyone. The grandmother alone in her apartment, and the young professional couple asleep in their condominium, and the elderly, married couple in their Glendale home were all equally at risk. There was no profile for potential victims that could be reassuring, no set of characteristics whose absence made you safe. Everyone, in the summer of 1985, felt that they could be next. That is what collective terror feels like. That is what one person, armed with weapons and pathology and the cover of darkness, can do to an entire metropolitan area. Chapter 6. The Trial. The people of the state of California versus Richard Ramirez. It was the most anticipated criminal trial in the history of Los Angeles County. And given that Los Angeles County had a history that included the Manson family murders, that was saying something. The case had everything that made the American courtroom a theater of public fascination. A defendant whose crimes had terrified a city, a mountain of evidence, a legal team that would argue fiercely over every procedural point, and a man in the dock who was by no means behaving in the way a defendant in a capital murder case might be expected to behave. Richard Ramirez seemed, from the moment he entered the criminal justice system in any serious way, to be enjoying himself. This is a clinical observation as much as a moral one. Among individuals diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, a diagnosis that many psychiatrists and psychologists who reviewed the Ramirez case considered applicable, there is sometimes a striking indifference to consequences, a lack of the anxiety that most people would feel in a situation of extreme legal jeopardy. Whether what Ramirez displayed was genuine pathological indifference or a performance of bravado is something that can be debated. What isn't not debatable is that his behavior in custody, in court, and in public was consistently provocative, theatrical, and unsettling. He came to his early court appearances with pentagrams drawn on his palms, which he would raise for the cameras, and the gallery when given the opportunity, he made satanic proclamations. He stared at people with an intensity that the press consistently described as unsettling, as if he were performing a kind of occult theater for the benefit of an audience he had imagined watching. He received letters in jail from women who found him attractive, who expressed admiration for his crimes, who offered themselves to him in written form. He enjoyed this. He responded to some of them. The phenomenon of an hybristophilia, the sexual attraction to violent criminals, has been documented extensively in the criminological literature, and Richard Ramirez attracted a particularly pronounced version of it. This was disturbing to investigators, to victims' families, and to thoughtful observers in general, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the ways in which media coverage of violent criminals can inadvertently create a kind of celebrity that the criminals themselves exploit. Preliminary hearings and pre-trial motions stretched on for years. This is not unusual in capital cases of this complexity. There were questions about the admissibility of evidence, about the constitutional validity of certain identification procedures, about the chain of custody for forensic evidence. There were motions to change venue, motions to suppress, motions to exclude. The legal machinery moved slowly, as it is designed to do in cases where the state seeks to take a human life, even a life that has taken many others. Ramirez cycled through attorneys. He was difficult to work with, demanding, unpredictable, resistant to legal advice that he perceived as insufficiently aligned with his own strategic preferences. At one point, he was representing himself, a notoriously dangerous choice in capital cases, before eventually settling on representation. During this extended pretrial period, something happened that surprised nearly everyone observing the case. Richard Ramirez fell in love. Her name was Doreen Lioe. She was a freelance magazine editor, 41 years old, who had begun writing to Ramirez in prison after seeing his face on television during his arrest, and having what she later described as an immediate and overwhelming emotional response to him. She visited him in jail. She continued writing to him. Over the course of years, a relationship developed, epistolary at first, then conducted through prison glass, deepening into something that both of them characterized as genuine romantic love. Their relationship attracted enormous media attention, much of it incredulous. How could an educated professional woman fall in love with a man who had murdered 13 people, who had raped and tortured survivors, who had mutilated the bodies of his victims? It was a question that spoke directly to the phenomenon of hybristophilia, to the psychological dynamics that lead some individuals to form attachments to violent criminals, and to the complex human capacity for compartmentalization, for keeping two incompatible realities in separate rooms of the mind, refusing to let them confront each other. Doreen Lioe reportedly told interviewers that she did not believe Ramirez was guilty, or that she did not care about his guilt, or that what she did not care about his guilt, or that what she felt for him transcended the question of what he had done. Different accounts from different points in the years of their relationship give different versions of her stated position. What was consistent was her commitment. She visited him. Throughout his incarceration, she was a constant presence in his life, and on October 3, 1996, she and Richard Ramirez were married in a ceremony at San Quentin State Prison. Ramirez was still on death row at the time. He would remain there for the rest of his life. The marriage was, in a certain sense, a footnote, or it would be, if it were not so illuminating about the specific kind of cultural phenomenon that serial killers with high media profiles can generate. The wedding of a mass murderer is not an ordinary event, and the woman who chose to become his wife was not, by any straightforward measure, a naive or damaged person. She was educated, employed, functional. She made a choice, with full knowledge of who she was marrying. This is one of the most enduring puzzles in the Ramirez case. Not what he did, which can be understood in terms of psychology and trauma and pathology and ideology, but what he inspired in others, what his image projected into the culture, and how that image could coexist with the reality of what he had done. The trial itself finally got underway in 1988, 3 years after Ramirez's arrest. It was held in Los Angeles Superior Court before Judge Tynan. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney Philip Halpin, who had spent years preparing a case of extraordinary complexity. The physical evidence alone was massive. Hundreds of exhibits, dozens of witnesses, forensic testimony spanning multiple murders, and attacks across more than a year of criminal activity. The prosecution's case was built around several pillars. First, the forensic evidence. The fingerprint from the Toyota. The ballistic evidence linking specific weapons to specific crimes. The trace evidence from crime scenes that connected the various incidents to a single perpetrator. Second, eyewitness testimony from survivors, from Maria Hernandez, from Inez Erickson, from others who had seen Richard Ramirez's face in the worst moments of their lives, and who were willing to sit in a courtroom and identify him across a room. Third, the pattern evidence, the signature elements that connected the crimes, the satanic imagery, the specific methods, the geographic range, the targeting of sleeping victims in their homes. The defense, for its part, attempted to challenge the reliability of eyewitness identification, to raise questions about forensic procedures, and to suggest that the fingerprint evidence was less definitive than the prosecution claimed. They also worked to humanize Ramirez, to present him as a product of his environment, of trauma, of circumstance, not as a monster beyond comprehension. This is a standard and legally appropriate defense strategy in capital cases. Defense attorneys in these situations are not endorsing their clients' crimes. They are doing their constitutional duty, which is to ensure that the prosecution meets the highest possible burden of proof and that the defendant receives the full protection of the law. This matters, not because the outcome in Ramirez's case should have been different. The evidence was overwhelming, but because the integrity of the legal process depends on vigorous defense. Even in cases where guilt is not seriously in doubt, the trial stretched on for more than a year of testimony, argument, and procedural complexity. Ramirez himself was a disruptive presence. He made comments in court. He displayed his palms with their pentagrams. He was removed from the courtroom on multiple occasions for disruptive behavior. He seemed, throughout, to be performing for an audience, to be less concerned with the outcome of the trial than with the theatrical opportunity it presented. On September 20th, 1989, after the longest deliberation in California history at that point, a jury that had struggled with the complexity of the case and the volume of evidence, the verdict came in: guilty on all 13 murder counts, guilty on multiple counts of attempted murder, sexual assault, robbery, and burglary. 4 days later, the jury returned the penalty verdict: death. Richard Ramirez was sentenced to die in California's gas chamber, later modified to lethal injection as the state changed its execution protocols. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend the rest of his life on death row. His response to the verdict was, characteristically, theatrical. Outside the theatrical courthouse, he told reporters, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." Chapter 7. Death Row. San Quentin State Prison sits on a point of land jutting into San Francisco Bay, north of the city, surrounded by water on 3 sides. It is one of the oldest prisons in California, opened in 1852, and it carries with it all the weight of its long and sometimes dark history. It is also, for the men on California's death row, a final destination, a place where the state parks its condemned while the long machinery of appeals and post-conviction review grinds through the years. Richard Ramirez arrived at San Quentin in late 1989 and would remain there for nearly a quarter century. Life on death row has its own rhythms, its own social ecology, its own strange normalcy within the abnormal. Condemned inmates in California's system are typically housed in single cells with limited movement and interaction compared to the general population. They have access to legal materials for their ongoing appeals. They can receive visitors. They can read, watch television, pursue whatever intellectual or creative interests they develop in confinement. They can write letters. Ramirez did all of these things. He continued to receive and respond to fan mail, a steady stream of letters from people across the country and around the world who found him compelling, frightening, attractive, or some combination of all 3. He continued his relationship with Doreen Lyo, which culminated in their prison marriage in 1996. He engaged with journalists and documentarians who sought access to him. He became, in the way that high-profile, condemned murderers sometimes do, a kind of celebrity prisoner, a figure around whom a whole cultural apparatus of fascination and horror constructed itself. He also appealed his conviction. The automatic appeal process in capital cases is extensive and mandatory in California, and Ramirez's case went through multiple levels of review over the years. His lawyers raised numerous issues: the length of the trial, the behavior of jurors, the admissibility of certain evidence, prosecutorial conduct. One appeal reached the California Supreme Court and raised a significant procedural question when it was discovered that one of the jurors had been discussing the case with a journalist during deliberations, a serious violation that some legal scholars argue required a retrial. The court ultimately ruled that while the jurors' behavior had been improper, it had not affected the verdict sufficiently to require a new trial. Each failed appeal was, in a sense, a reaffirmation of the verdict, a reconfirmation by a reviewing body that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming, that the trial, despite its complications, had been fair in the ways that mattered most, that Richard Ramirez had committed the crimes for which he had been convicted, and that the sentence was proportionate to those crimes. For the victims' families, the appeal process was its own kind of ongoing torture. Each new filing, each hearing, each legal maneuver meant revisiting the case, meant news coverage that brought back memories, meant the possibility, however remote, that the conviction might be overturned, that justice might be unraveled. They lived for years in this uncertainty, forced to remain tethered to the worst event of their lives by the slow movement of the legal system on death row. Richard Ramirez's physical condition gradually deteriorated. He had never been a person who paid much attention to his health. The decades of drug abuse, poor nutrition, and general physical neglect had taken a toll. As the years passed, he developed chronic health problems. His dental condition, already catastrophic at the time of his arrest, worsened. He was treated for various ailments over the years, but it was cancer that ultimately killed him. In June of 2013, Richard Ramirez died at Marin General Hospital of complications from B-cell lymphoma, a type of blood cancer. He was 53 years old. He had spent 23 years on death row, had never been executed by the state. The disease got there first. His death was announced in the afternoon, and the response was immediate and varied. Law enforcement officials and prosecutors who had worked the case expressed a quiet satisfaction, not exactly relief, but a sense of closure. Victims' families had more complicated responses. Some felt cheated. They had wanted to see the execution carried out, had wanted the finality of a sentence fulfilled, and instead found themselves receiving the news of a death from natural causes, as if Ramirez had somehow managed to evade the full weight of the law's verdict, even in the manner of his dying. Others felt something closer to relief, that it was finally, definitively over, that his name would no longer be in the news, that they could perhaps at last begin to move forward without the threat of legal proceedings pulling them back. Doreen Lyo, who had married him in 1996, had reportedly grown distant from him in the years before his death. Reports emerged that she had ended contact with him some time before he died, though the details of their estrangement were never fully made public. The marriage, which had seemed so improbable, and had attracted so much scrutiny, apparently did not outlast the passage of years, and the weight of the truth she had spent so long trying to hold at a distance. Richard Ramirez was buried without public ceremony. There was no funeral. His body wasn't cremated, and his ashes were reportedly returned to family members. There was no grave marker that his name adorned, no specific location that became a site of memorial or of morbid tourism, as sometimes happens with the burial places of notorious killers. He simply ceased to be. The physical man was gone. What remained was the damage. The family still living without the people he had killed. The survivors still carrying the scars. The city still in some corner of its scar. Collective memory, remembering the summer when the Night Stalker walked its streets. Chapter 8. The Psychology of Evil. What made Richard Ramirez? This is the question that criminologists, psychologists, and true crime observers have been asking since his crimes first became known, and it is a question that, even now, with decades of distance and research and reflection, does not have a single clean answer. The easy answer is that he was a monster, that he was simply and fundamentally evil in a way that does not require or admit of further explanation. This answer has the advantage of emotional clarity and the disadvantage of being essentially meaningless as an analytical tool. Monster is a word that stops inquiry. It says, This is beyond understanding. Stop asking, but the compulsion to understand is not idle curiosity or morbid fascination. Understanding how violence of this scale is produced is essential if we want to prevent it, if we want to recognize warning signs, if we want to build social structures that catch people before they reach the terminal point of their trajectory. So, let us try to understand, with the clear acknowledgement that understanding is not excusing, that explanation is not justification. The developmental psychologists and trauma specialists who have studied cases like Ramirez's tend to identify a combination of factors that, in interaction, produce the conditions for extreme violence. No single factor is determinative. Rather, it is the accumulation and interaction of multiple factors: genetic, neurological, environmental, psychological, social, that creates the specific conditions in which a person becomes capable of the things Richard Ramirez did. The first factor is early trauma. The household Ramirez grew up in was one where fear was a constant presence, where violence was a normalized tool of parental authority, where emotional safety was not reliable. Research on adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, in the literature has established clear correlations between early trauma and a wide range negative adult outcomes, including violent behavior. Children who grow up in high ACE environments have measurably different neurological development from children who grow up in stable, safe environments. The stress response system is calibrated differently. The capacity for emotional regulation is impaired. The ability to trust, to form attachments, to access empathy, all of these are affected. This does not mean that every child who grows up in a violent household becomes a violent adult. The vast majority do not. But it does mean that the risk is elevated, and that the specific form the risk takes depends heavily on what other factors are present in the developing child's life. The second factor is exposure to graphic violence in a context of admiration. This is where the influence of Miguel Ramirez becomes particularly significant. The cousin who showed young Ricardo the photographs of dead bodies, who talked about killing with pride and relish, who modeled a particular relationship to violence, one in which it was associated with power and masculinity, rather than with horror and moral failure, provided a kind of instruction manual for a child whose neural architecture was already being shaped by trauma. The message was absorbed at a deep level. Violence is what powerful people do. If you want to be powerful, violence is available to you. The third factor is the witnessed murder. Watching his cousin shoot Jesse Ramirez in the face was a singular event in Ricardo's psychological development. The impact of witnessing violence at close range, particularly violence committed by someone you know, someone you admire, is profound, and the fact that Miguel Ramirez faced minimal legal consequences for the murder reinforced a specific belief in young Ricardo, that the world would not stop you if you chose violence, that you could do terrible things and walk away. The fourth factor is substance abuse. By his early teens, Ricardo Ramirez was regularly using marijuana, and later progressed to harder drugs, including cocaine. Chronic substance abuse during adolescence, a period of critical neurological development, has documented effects on executive function, on impulse control, on the capacity for long-term reasoning. Drugs became, for Ramirez, both a coping mechanism and an accelerant. They helped him manage whatever pain he was carrying while simultaneously impairing the cognitive systems that might have served as brakes on violent impulses. The fifth factor is ideology. The adoption of Satanism as a personal identity and worldview was not incidental to Ramirez's crimes. It provided a framework within which his violence could be understood, not as pathology, not as moral failure, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a form of devotion, as participation in a cosmic conflict in which he was on the side of power and transgression against a society he had decided was his enemy. Ideology does not make people violent, but it can give shape and meaning to violent impulses that are already present, can transform inchoate rage into something that feels purposeful and even righteous. None of these factors alone would have been enough. Together, they formed a specific and terrible combination. There is a concept in criminology called the homicidal triad, a set of childhood behavioral markers that researchers have associated with elevated risk of violent offending in adulthood. The three elements are bedwetting in late childhood, fire-setting, and cruelty to animals. Ramirez's childhood history with respect to these specific markers is not fully documented in the public record, and the triad itself has been subject to significant scientific criticism for its lack of predictive power when applied broadly. But it speaks to a larger truth, that the seeds of extreme adult violence are typically visible in childhood if one knows how to look. With Ramirez, the seeds were visible. The trauma, the violence in the home, the exposure to graphic imagery, the substance abuse, all of these were knowable facts about a child and an adolescent who was moving through social institutions that might, if better designed and better resourced, have intervened. Schools, churches, social service agencies, the criminal justice system, all of them encountered Ricardo Ramirez during his years of formation, and none of them managed to alter his trajectory in any meaningful way. This is a systemic observation, not a moral condemnation of any individual teacher or social worker or police officer who crossed paths with the young Ramirez. The systems were not designed to catch people like him, to recognize the specific combination of factors that was assembling itself into something catastrophic, to provide the kind of intensive, sustained support that might have made a difference. They were designed for more ordinary interventions, and ordinary interventions were not equal to the task. The psychologists who have written about Ramirez are generally in agreement that he would today meet the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, possibly overlapping with traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathy. These are clinical terms, not moral judgments, and they describe a cluster of characteristics: lack of empathy, disregard for others' rights and well-being, manipulation, grandiosity, absence of remorse, that Ramirez displayed consistently throughout his criminal career and his years in prison. He showed no genuine remorse for what he had done. Ideological terms rather than accepting moral responsibility. He continued to seek attention and admiration. Whether psychopathy is a category that meaningfully explains behavior or merely describes it as a debate that continues in the clinical literature. But what is clear is that Ramirez, by the time he reached adulthood, was a person for whom other human beings did not register as fully real, as fully valuable, as ends in themselves rather than means to his own ends. This is not a supernatural quality. It is a psychological state that has roots in neurology, in development, in experience. It is, in principle, something that can be understood, which means that, in principle, it is something that can sometimes be recognized early enough to matter. Chapter 9. Legacy and Impact. The legacy of Richard Ramirez is complicated, as the legacies of all figures who exist at the intersection of extreme violence and cultural fascination tend to be complicated. On the most immediate and practical level, his crimes prompted significant changes in law enforcement procedures in California. The inability of the LAPD and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to effectively coordinate during the height of the Night Stalker investigation exposed serious problems in interagency communication and information sharing. In the aftermath, both departments worked to improve coordination, to develop better protocols for cases that cross jurisdictional lines. The California Department of Justice also strengthened its role as a statewide clearinghouse for information about serial cases. The use of the automated fingerprint identification system in identifying Ramirez was an early and highly publicized demonstration of the power of the technology, and it accelerated the adoption of AFIS databases by law enforcement agencies across the country. The Ramirez case became a textbook example, cited in law enforcement training, of both the failures and the eventual successes of investigative technology. The fingerprint that broke the case, the print recovered from the stolen Toyota, was, in a very direct sense, the point at which modern forensic science changed the outcome. The media coverage of the Night Stalker case also had lasting effects on how the press and the public engaged with serial crime. The extensive reporting, the publication of Ramirez's photograph, the saturation coverage during the weeks of his terror, all of this shaped the template for how subsequent high-profile serial murder cases would be covered. It also raised questions, some of which have never been fully resolved, about the relationship between media coverage and criminal celebrity, about whether extensive coverage of serial killers inadvertently creates the kind of notoriety that the killers themselves seek, about whether there is a responsible way to inform the public about ongoing dangers without feeding the vanity of the people creating those dangers. In the broader cultural sphere, Richard Ramirez became one of the most widely referenced serial killers in the American popular imagination, a figure who appeared in true crime books and documentaries, in podcasts and television series, in academic studies and journalistic investigations. His name became shorthand for a particular kind of nocturnal terror, for the violation of the sanctity of the home, for the presence of irreducible evil in the middle of ordinary American life. The true crime genre, books, podcasts, documentaries, television series, has struggled and continues to struggle with the question of how to handle figures like Richard Ramirez responsibly. The genre is driven by a genuine and widespread human appetite for stories about crime and death and the darkest corners of human behavior. This appetite is not pathological in itself. We are drawn to these stories for many reasons, including a need to understand mortality and evil, a desire to make sense of a world that contains terrible things, a kind of imaginative rehearsal for dangers we hope never to encounter. True crime, at its best, can provide genuine insight into the workings of law enforcement, the criminal justice system, the psychology of violence, and the long human cost of crime. At its worst, it can sensationalize and glamorize the perpetrators of violence while marginalizing their victims, can treat real human suffering as entertainment, can feed precisely the kind of celebrity dynamic that people like Ramirez sought and exploited. The challenge, which this account has tried to meet with whatever degree of success, is to tell the story of a killer in a killer, a way that neither erases him, pretending he did not exist, or that his crimes can be sanitized into abstraction, nor elevates him, treating him as a romantic or heroic figure, centering his perspective above those of his victims. The story must be told with the perpetrator present, because ignoring him serves no one's understanding, but it must be told in a way that keeps the humanity of the victims at the center. Whether any particular telling succeeds at this is for the audience to judge, but the attempt must always be made, for the survivors of Richard Ramirez's attacks, and for the families of those he killed. His death in 2013 did not represent closure in any simple sense. Closure is a concept that the psychology of grief has, in recent decades, complicated significantly. The idea that the loss of someone important, or the resolution of a legal case, or the death of a perpetrator, produces a clean ending to the process of mourning has been challenged by research showing that grief does not move toward closure in a linear way. It is more complicated. It persists, it transforms, but it does not disappear. For the families of the people Richard Ramirez killed, the years after his capture were years of managing an ongoing loss, of building lives that contained the permanent absence of their loved ones, of finding ways to remember and to grieve while also continuing to live. Some became advocates, channeling their experience into work on behalf of victims' rights or crime prevention. Others chose privacy, declining to participate in the ongoing media cycle around the case, seeking to keep the people they had lost out of the machinery of true crime commodification. These were all legitimate choices, and they reflected the individual ways in which people navigate the particular catastrophe of losing someone to murder. Maria Hernandez, who survived the attack that killed Dale Okazaki, has spoken publicly about her experiences in the years since. She has described the complex emotional landscape of being a survivor, the gratitude for her own survival, the grief for her friend, the anger, the fear that lingered for years, the difficulty of returning to normal life when normal had been so catastrophically disrupted. Her testimony, like that of other survivors who have chosen to speak, is a reminder that the experience of violence does not end when the physical attack ends. It extends forward in time, shaping everything that follows. Inez Erickson, who survived the Mission Vio attack, became a visible advocate for crime victims and for changes in the systems designed to support them. She channeled her experience, the horror of that night, the complicated process of recovery, the long engagement with the legal system, into work that helped other people in similar situations. Her advocacy was not a resolution of her trauma. It was a use of it, a transformation of her trauma, something terrible into something that could be of service. This is one of the ways that some survivors manage to carry what has been done to them without being crushed by its weight. Chapter 10. What we carry. We are near the end of this account. The story of Richard Ramirez, his origins, his crimes, his capture, his trial, his years on death row, his death, has been told. The facts have been laid out. The psychology has been explored. The victims have been named and humanized to whatever extent words on a page can do justice to the people they describe. What remains is the question of what we take away from a story like this one. What do we carry with us? And what should we do with what we carry? The first thing we carry is knowledge of what human beings are capable of, not the comfortable knowledge. The knowledge of what we are capable of at our best, the compassion and creativity and courage and love that we display in ordinary life, but the darker knowledge, that under the right combination of circumstances, of trauma and neglect and ideology and opportunity, a person can become something that will commit the acts that Richard Ramirez committed. This knowledge is uncomfortable. It disrupts the self-flattering narrative we sometimes construct about human nature, the one in which evil is always foreign, always other, always something that happens somewhere else among people unlike ourselves. The truth is more unsettling. Evil is not imported from some external source. It is assembled here, among us, from materials that are often recognizable and understandable. The trauma of childhood violence is recognizable, and transgression in certain cultural currents is recognizable. The failure of systems designed to protect and support children is recognizable. The normalization of substances that impair judgment and inhibition is recognizable. None of these things, individually, produces a Richard Ramirez, but in combination, shaped by the specific vulnerabilities of a specific individual, they can. Knowing this does not make us culpable for what individuals do, but it does make us communities, as institutions, as societies, accountable for the conditions we create and permit. If we know that early childhood trauma dramatically elevates the risk of later violence, then we have reason to invest in the prevention, and we have reason to invest in treatment of childhood trauma. If we know that children who witness domestic violence are more likely to perpetuate it, then we have reason to take domestic violence seriously as a public health issue rather than a private matter. If we know that the systems designed to intervene in troubled adolescent lives are chronically underfunded and undersupported, then we have reason to make the political decisions that would change that. These are not radical conclusions. They are straightforward applications of what the research tells us, but they are conclusions that require us to engage with the uncomfortable reality that violence is not simply a matter of individual bad choices, that it has structural and systemic dimensions that demand structural and systemic responses. The second thing we carry is a responsibility toward the people who were harmed. The victims of Richard Ramirez were real people. They are not characters in a story. They are not props in a narrative about a killer's psychology. They had names and faces and histories and people who loved them. Some of them died. Some of them survived and went on to rebuild their lives with the weight of what had been done to them as a permanent part of who they were. All of them deserved better. All of them deserved to live in a world where what happened to them did not happen. When we consume stories about violence, in books, in podcasts, in documentaries, in true crime series, we owe it to the people whose suffering fuels these narratives to approach them with full seriousness, with full recognition of their humanity. We owe it to them not to treat their worst moments as entertainment in the shallow sense, as thrills to be consumed and set aside. We owe it to them to let their experience actually land, to feel the weight of what was done, to carry some of that forward, rather than processing it as spectacle and moving on. This is not a condemnation of the true crime genre or of the people who are drawn to it. It is simply an argument for a certain quality of attention, for the kind of engagement with these stories that honors the reality they describe rather than aestheticizing it, that keeps the victims at the center rather than aestheticizing it, then at the margins. The third thing we carry is a question about justice means in cases like this, about whether the legal system's response to Richard Ramirez achieved anything that could meaningfully be called justice. In one sense, the trial and conviction were justice. A thorough legal process identified the perpetrator of serious crimes, evaluated the evidence, applied the law, and reached a verdict that was then confirmed by appellate review. The system worked, in the narrow sense that it was designed to work, to produce a verdict that reflected the facts. But in the larger sense, in the sense of making the victims whole, of restoring what was taken, of providing a proportionate response to what was done, justice is not achievable. There is no legal verdict that brings Jenny Vinco back, that heals Inez Erickson, that restores Bill Carnes to the man he was before August 24, 1985. The law can punish and contain. It cannot undo. It cannot repair. It cannot give back what was taken. This is the fundamental tragedy at the heart of criminal justice in cases involving extreme violence. The system does what it can, and what it can do is important and worth doing. But it can do is important and worth doing. Falls infinitely short of what the victims actually deserve, which is to have had none of this happen to them in the first place. The only real justice, the kind that actually prevents the harm, is prospective. It is the effort to identify and interrupt trajectories before they reach their catastrophic end. It is the investment in children's well-being, in mental health treatment, in violence prevention, in the structural conditions that make people safer. It is the boring, undramatic, incremental work of reducing the conditions under which people like Richard Ramirez are produced. This is unglamorous work. It does not make for compelling true crime narratives, but it is the only work that matters if what we want is not just to catch and punish the killers who have already done their damage, but to prevent the killing in the first place. Richard Ramirez died on June 7, 2013. At Marin General Hospital. He was 53 years old. He had spent more than half his adult life on death row. He was never executed. He died of cancer, of a body that had been mistreated for decades finally failing. He left behind him 13 families who would never be whole again. Dozens of survivors who had rebuilt their lives around the permanent fact of what had been done to them. A city that had, for a time, known real collective terror, and that had never fully forgotten it. A case that became a landmark in California legal history, in forensic science history, in the history of American true crime. He also left behind a name that became, in the cultural vocabulary, synonymous with a particular kind of nocturnal predation, with the violation of the home, with the face of a home, violence that hides behind an ordinary exterior until the moment it does not. The Night Stalker. It is a name that has outlasted him. It is a name that carries with it the weight of everything we have covered in this account. The victims, the investigations, the failures, the eventual capture, the long legal aftermath. It is a name that should always, when it is spoken, bring to mind not primarily the man who earned it, but the people who suffered because of him. Genivenko, Dale Okazaki, Tsai Lian Yu, Vincent and Maxine Zazara, Harold Wu, Blanche Wolfe, Mary Louise Cannon, Joyce Lucille Nelson, Maxon and Leela Knighting, Chainarong Covenant, Peter Pan, Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson, who survived, and all the others, the named and unnamed, the confirmed and the possible, the dead and the living. They are the reason this story is told. They are what this story is ultimately about. Their lives mattered. Their loss mattered. Their survival mattered. And they deserve, always, to be remembered not as footnotes in the story of the man who harmed them, but as the full and irreplaceable human beings they were. This has been Richard Ramirez, The Night Stalker. A true crime audiobook account. Author's note. The events described in this account are historical and drawn from public records, court documents, investigative reporting, and documented sources. This audiobook is intended as an educational and journalistic examination of a significant criminal case and its impact. The names of all victims are included with full recognition of their humanity and in the spirit of honoring their memory. The psychological and criminological analysis presented reflect documented research and professional literature in those fields.